Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for being here with us. My name is Massimo Gaggi. I'm an editorialist at Corriere della Sera. I've been working in the United States for about 20 years. I'm very happy that I have the opportunity tonight to moderate this roundtable. I normally talk about issues such as tariffs and Trump's policies. This time, we are going to talk about a much more specific and relevant topic, a complex one as well, namely the freedom of expression and its limitation in the academic world and beyond. I thank you very much for being here. We have MARTA CARTABIA and we have also Professor SUNSTEIN, who is connected remotely. I will just spend a very few words to tell you who MARTA CARTABIA is. I'm sure that you all know who she is. You've read a lot about her on papers. You've seen her on TV. She is a judge, and then she was the president of the Constitutional Court. She was also Minister for Justice during the Draghi government. At the moment, she is a professor at Bocconi University, and she's also very much committed in various activities and organizations, both in Italy and abroad. In particular, she works at the Venice Commission, which is basically a body that promotes the dissemination of democracy through the law. I will say a few words on Professor CASS SUNSTEIN, who is a very important figure in the economic and legal world. He is a constitutionalist. I met him in 2008 when he published one of his very successful books. It was an enlightening book for me. It's called Nudge. I also reviewed the book. It was also published in Italy by Feltrinelli, called La Spinta Gentile, the gentle nudge. And it expresses the idea of Professor SUNSTEIN. I know he's listening to us, he's getting the translation. I will keep on speaking in Italian. I can see you nodding, meaning that you are getting the English translation and you are following what I'm saying. Professor SUNSTEIN also translated his economic philosophy of the so-called behavioral economics. The idea is to nudge behaviors so as to make administrative duties easier. This was then applied by the Obama administration in 2009. He joined an office which worked exactly on that, promoting information and the dissemination of rules through tools which might somehow be more friendly, less oppressive for citizens in all fields, from pension systems to making fiscal systems easier. I also briefly interviewed him. Maybe you don't remember it, but at the end of a conference in Washington 2009 or 2010, I had the lucky chance of interviewing you. Professor SUNSTEIN now teaches at the Harvard University, where he's director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy. He keeps on working various books. I have the latest one, which is now being published in Italy, How to Become Famous, the secrets of success. That's the title in Italian. We invited him here because of another book that you published last year. The title was
Campus
Free Speech.
Campus Free Speech,
Namely the freedom of expression at university campuses. As you might know, because you've seen it on TV, you've read it on papers, recently Donald Trump is working on a rather heavy campaign towards universities, because especially the ones that he considers as progressive, the Ivy League universities, he's already implemented various restrictive measures. He's removed funding to research for some of these academic institutions. In the case of Harvard, we've even got to the point to, in my opinion, an absurd measure, namely asking for stopping the access of foreign students and even sending away away the ones who are currently enrolled, which,
La magistratura
as you know, the judicial is now putting in question. But we're not here to talk about that. And by the way, the book published by the professor was published in September last year, so much before the elections of Trump. Now, we're going to talk in more general terms, and of course, we will have time for questions. We're going to tackle the issue of academic freedom, any possible limitations, to which extent this can be regulated, because there were issues in the past as well, problems in terms of excesses in the cancel culture, groups who tried to stop the dissemination of ideas which were not shared by some radical groups, be it on the right or on the left. So we already saw some problems before. Professor SUNSTEIN, for what I read in his book, set out a goal. Maybe in the beginning you didn't even want to write a book, maybe just some guidelines for yourselves and colleagues. You call yourself a plumber. You followed your professional method, namely you looked at various cases, different cases, to see in each one single cases which pros and cons can be detected, and to see whether certain things can be regulated or not, what is illicit or not. And we're going to talk about this also with Professor Cartabia. Of course, there are differences between Europe and the United States in terms of freedom of speech. The US, thanks to the First Amendment, recognizes its absolute right to free speech. However, in some cases, there is a limitation when it comes to hate speech. But, you know, the freedom of speech is much more extended in the United States than it is in Europe. So I will stop here, and I will kindly ask you whether you can start and tell us something about your experience as a plumber in tackling the issue of freedom of speech in academia, and then we will take it from there.
Great, thank you. It's a tremendous honor to get to speak to you all, and I am grateful for your use of the technology, and I am also grateful for your tolerance of this barbaric language in which I'm speaking. This is an act of generosity and kindness, as well as respect for the free speech of someone whose Italian is very impoverished. So thank you for that. I've written a little book for you, a new book based on the book to which you kindly referred. It's a short book, and it comes in 4 chapters. And I'm hoping that Europe and North America will be very parallel, not exactly the same, but very parallel, in particular because our system of freedom of expression is greatly informed by fascism and a response to fascism, and this is also true in Europe. The epigraph for the little book, which you're about to hear, is from the 1940s. It's the greatest sentence ever written by a member of the United States Supreme Court. And the sentence is, compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard, and that is a response to censors of all kinds, whether they are communists or fascists or elected officials in a generally free nation. Okay, so chapter 1. In any free nation, some kinds of speech are protected and some kinds of speech are not protected. This is true in Italy, it's true in France, it's true in Canada, and it's true in Mexico. Here are some categories of speech that are generally unprotected: bribery, perjury, fraud, and plagiarism. So on campus, if someone says, I have a product that will prevent you from ever going bald, that is fraud, I regret to say, and it is not protected by the free speech principle. If a student or a teacher writes a paper with the aid of artificial intelligence, and it's extremely informed and very well written, the student can be punished for that. Free speech does not protect that student. If a professor says to a female student, if you go on a date with me tonight, your grade will be better, that is sexual harassment and it is not protected speech. If a professor says in class, students who are white are very good at literature and students who are black just can't understand literature, the university can say, in order to be a teacher, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, and you just did. So these are categories of speech that are not protected. If someone says outside a building, please come destroy the building because the university is supporting Israel, that creates a clear and present danger of harm in circumstances in which it's likely to incite and intended to incite even a lawless action. That is not protected speech. And notice it's a narrow category, intended to incite and likely to incite imminent lawless action. Okay, those are core categories of unprotected speech in most nations, and a system that is enthusiastic about freedom of speech need not tolerate those. In my country, there is no restriction on hate speech. The category does not exist. If I say something like, I think that white people are better basketball players than black people, that cannot be characterized as regulable speech. If I say something like men are better at math than women, that might be thought to be hate speech, but it is not regulable. Hate speech is not regulable as such. If someone says something terrible about Israel, or something terrible about Palestine, or something terrible about the United States, or something terrible about Canada, all of those are protected speech. That means that anti-Semitic speech is protected, offensive speech is protected, inflammatory speech is protected, and the reason is that compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. The speech that is unprotected, usually unprotected for two reasons. First, it doesn't have much value. If I say my product prevents blindness, that doesn't contribute to democracy. It's not a reflection of individual autonomy. And it's immediately harmful because people who are suffering from hair loss will lose their money in the hope that they will get help. That's the end of the first chapter, protected speech and unprotected speech. The second chapter takes aim at communist and fascist governments of all kinds. It distinguishes among three kinds of restrictions on speech. This is fundamental. The first kind of restriction on speech is viewpoint-based. Viewpoint-based. That means that whether the restriction applies depends on the viewpoint of the speaker. If you say you can't criticize President Trump, but you can say wonderful things about President Trump, that is viewpoint-based. If you say you can't criticize the United States with respect to slavery, but you can say great things about the United States, that's viewpoint-based. If you say you cannot say harsh things about Israel, you cannot complain about the founding of Israel, but you can celebrate the founding of Israel and say wonderful things about Israel, that's viewpoint-based. Viewpoint-based restrictions are almost always invalid. They are the core violation of free speech principles. There are some restrictions that are content-based, but are viewpoint neutral. So this is a little tricky, but the idea is you can restrict speech because of its content without targeting a particular viewpoint. So if you say you cannot talk about Rome, no discussion of Rome, or no discussion of Catholicism, those are not permissible topics, or no discussion of race relation or civil rights. That's content-based but viewpoint neutral. Content-based restrictions are also almost always invalid. Viewpoint-based restrictions are essentially always invalid. Content-based restrictions are almost always invalid. Then there's a third category of restriction, and there was an example of this at an important university, my university, I confess, from a few days ago, where some students at graduation held up signs when they were receiving their diplomas on political issues. They held up big signs saying things about the Middle East in general. That's against the rules. The reason against the rules is not the content, it's not the viewpoint. It's just you're not allowed when you're receiving your diploma to speak. It's a time, place, and manner restriction that is neutral with respect to content. Content neutral restrictions aren't automatically valid, but they are regarded more favorably. These may or may not be familiar categories. I want to suggest that they're fundamental. A viewpoint-based restriction on campus or in a city strikes at the core of freedom. A content-neutral restriction is a lot better. If you say you can't be very loud between the hours of midnight and when people wake up, that's designed to allow people to sleep. If you say you can't take over a building, that's designed to allow people to use the building. Time, place, and manner restrictions that are content neutral may or may not be valid. They need a good justification, but they're viewed a lot more receptively, and that makes sense. That's chapter 2, content-based, viewpoint-based, content neutral. The third chapter is going to be the shortest, and I hope it will be intuitive. It's about the use of government money to get people to do things or to say things or not to say things. If the government of Germany says to German universities, we're going to have a project in 2026, it's to celebrate democracy. And we are going to fund universities for democracy celebration year. If professors are writing about the history of democracy or the importance of democracy or the wonderfulness of democracy, they get money. That's what the money's for. In my country, at least, that is permissible. The government can fund projects that it wants. If it wants to fund patriotism, it can do that. If it wants to fund animal rights, my 2 dogs are with me right now, it can do that. If it wants to celebrate the history of France, it can do that. By contrast, if the government says you will receive money only if you agree to say that Israel was great whenever you speak, that is not okay. If the government says we will give you money if all of your faculty agrees to say that the United States is a wonderful nation and its history is something to celebrate, that's not permissible. In other words, you can give money to fund programs that you like, but you can't use federal money. You can't use the government's money to prevent people from engaging in otherwise protected speech. So if there was an idea that at Yale, for example, the government will give money to Yale only if Yale agrees that all of its teachers will support President Trump, that is an unconstitutional condition. Now, there are some hard cases between the 2 lines. That is, one, funding programs that are celebratory of, let's say, sports, and using federal money, government money, to get people to shut up or to speak out. But the basic idea is very simple. And what we're seeing in, let's say, a country whose initials in English are USA, in my country, that country, we're seeing courts strike things down on the ground that they are unconstitutional conditions. And this is fundamental, I think, both to Europe and to North America. and it identifies a big problem in nations that are not committed to freedom of speech. That's the third chapter. The fourth and final chapter is called Hard Cases. And all I want to say about the hard cases is, first, the educational mission in every university does call for some restrictions on the content of speech. I teach constitutional law. If I decided my constitutional law course would be devoted to climate change, my university could say, you have to teach your constitutional law course. It's not a climate change course. If I started spending my entire constitutional law course talking about animal rights and my dogs, my university could say, you can't do that. It's a constitutional law course. Universities, because of their academic mission, are legitimately entitled to restrict speech in ways the government can't. Now, viewpoint neutrality is required, but some form of content regulation is built into the educational enterprise. If a student writes a paper in one of my law courses about Shakespeare or Leonardo da Vinci, I can say that's not going to get a passing grade because it's a constitutional law course. So the academic mission does raise some hard cases. Another set of hard cases is raised by academic freedom. It may or may not be clear that there's a right to academic freedom as such. If there's a right to freedom of speech, students and teachers have some free speech rights. Is there an independent right to academic freedom? That's not clear. Free speech, yes, for sure. Academic freedom, question mark, question mark. Okay, I just want to conclude by saying in many nations in the world, including regrettably mine, free speech is under unusual pressure. And the last time that happened was in the 1950s and 1940s. And if we have a shining star in our constitutional constellation, it's that no one can regulate speech because they disagree with its viewpoint. If we hold fast to that kind of standard, then freedom will be preserved, even in difficult times, in a place where freedom is most needed, which is at the university, which along with the military is the arsenal of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think, penso di aver letto nel suo libro anche che in alcuni casi
Thank you. I think I wrote in your book that you try to respect these principles and even supporting freedom of speech in expressing some concepts that are very horrible. But since we have a freedom of speech, you support even that because the First Amendment supports this. I thought it was also very interesting, your very accurate classification. So this plumber was able to fix everything. But I would ask Professor Cantabria if she has something to say about the European context. I remember in 1968,
in architettura dei corsi esclusivamente di politica.
When you were studying architecture, sometimes you had courses about politics, but nowadays in the Italian and European academic institution, well, what's happening?
Grazie per l'invito.
Well, thank you, Tito, and thank you, Massimo Gaggi, for the introduction. It's an honor to be here to talk and share a virtual stage with one of the most prominent figures, not only as far as the constitutional law, but many more. I never had the chance to meet him in person, but I'm very glad to be here today. say. I would like, first of all, to underline some differences compared to constitutional law in the US. And I would like to do that by stressing 2 points. First of all, in many European constitutions, we have both some provisions about freedom of speech, as well as provisions about protection of academic freedom. And the second observation, while on free speech in Europe, we usually tolerate some limits that in the US would not be tolerated, and I'm going to go back there. The right to oblivion is something that could have never happened in the US but happened in Europe. As far as academic freedom, there are less limits, and I would like to explain this a little bit better. If I'm going to be too long, please stop me before. So in the Italian Constitution, there is Article 21 dedicated to freedom of thought, and Article 33 about academic freedom. The same happens in Germany and in other European countries. And the same can be found in the Chart of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, written in 2000. Well, first of all, there is a difference in European context. When the American Constitution was written, the European Constitution were written like Germany, Italy. So in Italy and Germany, the Constitution were written after the Second World War. So the history has been a very difficult history. There was a pressure both on freedom of speech and academic freedom. These constitutions are so-called never again constitution, meaning that some principles have been enshrined, principles that people don't want to lose ever again in the future history. And what happened? Well, as far as freedom of thought and speech, we had censorship, propaganda, all that characterized totalitarianisms in Europe. More specifically, as far as academic freedom, in 1938, fascism imposes university professor a sort of, they had to say that they would be loyal to the regime. So most people who were Jews in 1931, about 12 out of more than 1,000 refused to promise their loyalty, and they were exiled. But why is it so important? Why should we protect university professors? It is a small group of people in the end compared to the rest of the planet. It looks almost like an elite freedom. Well, it's not like that, according to those who wrote the Constitution. The problem that we had in Italy and Germany, well, we had to rebuild from the ground up the grounds of democracy. And the role of school, education, academia, and university was considered essential to build democracy.
One of the famous sentences of one of the fathers of the Italian Constitution, Piero Calamandrei, who is often mentioned because it's a really relevant observation. Well, what he said is that school was the first among democratic institutions. We are at the end of the Second World War. The population is still illiterate in Italy. Most people are illiterate. And so the problem of these countries at that historical moment was to rebuild a democracy which, among its components, would also have an aware citizenship, citizens who are able to use critical thought. Now, this is a key point in each democracy that is alive and kicking. And it's very different from the US Constitution. It's much older. It didn't come from the trauma of Nazism and fascism. The perspective, the outlook is completely different. And that's why in Italy and in German, the first worry was the right, for instance, to study. That's why we have academic freedom. The idea was to create a strong network of educational institutions up to universities where it would be possible to offer adequate education to all citizens, and according to Article 34 of our constitutions, for the worthy up to the highest levels of education. Again, the idea of academic freedom, the idea of educational freedom, of freedom of thought, is very much related to this idea and this need to build a democracy. In Europe, luckily, we have a few proof to the opposite, but we see that when you have a crisis of democracy, one of the first targets, along with other neutral institutions, but one of the first targets are universities and academic freedom. I'll just make a couple of examples so that I can give you some current examples. In Turkey, think of Turkey. I mean, these are examples that I take from the Council of Europe, so the enlarged Europe of 47 countries. In Turkey, after 2016, 73 academics were fired, were sent away because they expressed their thought, and they signed a call, a manifesto for peace. This went up to the Court of Human Rights, but the interesting thing is to see how an authoritative measure then hit those 73 people. I mean, what can 73 professors do? What can they do other than expressing their opinion? Another example is that of Hungary. In 2018, the Central European University was forcibly moved. It was chased away from Hungary. It was relocated in Vienna because it was considered as a free institution that was not appreciated. So, to conclude, academic freedom in Europe, and again, this is something that is felt very different in the United States. The academic freedom is, yes, it's the freedom of individual professors, the freedom of students to express their opinions, to teach and do research as they see fit, but it also has an institutional aspect. It is the freedom to create universities that are not necessarily state universities and which might follow a strongly characterized nature and approach. The case of Hungary is the case of a university that is targeted because it is not aligned with the current approach of the government. Second point, and I'll try and be quick on this, in Europe, if we think of the taxonomy of cases that Professor SUNSTEIN described, and so we hear that free speech is not absolute in the United States. Sometimes we superficially think that you can say whatever. I mean, that there are no limitations. There are limitations at certain conditions, which might not have necessarily with content, but with other aspects as well. And so it's interesting to hear that if something can cause an imminent danger, it's something that can be restricted and is seen upon with suspicion. Well, here in Europe, we have a few more limitations to the freedom of speech because the European culture of rights is a sort of a more relational culture. In other words, we don't normally safeguard or protect the individual right in an isolated manner, but it's always seen in terms of relations that that right can have on the rights of other people. Rights are always described with their limitations. If you look at the Italian Constitution, for instance, it recognizes the personal freedom, but then there's a long list of cases where it can actually be limited. The same is true for all other rights. And these are always limitations that are explained because it is important to protect and safeguard the rights of others. We were here referring before to hate speech. Hate speech is not forbidden in the United States. It can be, and it is banned in many European countries because the idea is that you need to safeguard the dignity of other people, the reputation of other people, the honor of other people, which is not instead considered as a sufficient motivation to ban hate speech in the United States. Of course, we follow the principle of proportionality, but I'm not going to delve on that. There is a difference, and there's a famous case, Google Spain. What happened was that a man put his name on Google, and what he saw was a problem when he hadn't paid his tax. It was one of the first results given by Google Spain, and he thought that would taint his reputation, not because it wasn't true, but because it was still there after 20, 30 years. The Court of Justice of the European Union asked Google to de-index this piece of information. I had a lot of discussions with American colleagues on this issue. I remember I talked to Robert Post as well, and they said, well, this is unacceptable in the United States. It would never happen. I don't know whether you agree with me, with them, sorry. But in Europe, we have this sense, this understanding that the freedom of thought must take stock of other needs, including the dignity and reputation of other people, which are not secondary factors. Academic freedom instead has none of these limitations. That doesn't mean that, again, it's a total freedom. The freedom of research, for instance, of course, has some ethical considerations. There are protocols of ethical protocols that are being developed because of these reasons. But those limitations on the freedom of expression, if it taints other people's dignity, that doesn't apply to academia. So maybe it's the reverse of what we were saying before, at least in terms of general principles. Maybe on individual cases, the outcomes might be similar, but in principles there are differences. Why academic freedom in the United States doesn't have the limitations that we have in Europe? Well, because the idea, the hypothesis, the assumption is that academic work, academic research follow a method and evidence, including in dissemination outside of university, that should not be subject to judgment. Academic research contributes to enriching thought, even if the outcome of research might disrupt consolidated knowledge, and yet it's always added value for an extended, a plural discussion on any kind of topic. Academic freedom certainly means freedom of research, it certainly means freedom of teaching, but it also means freedom of disseminating information beyond universities. Universities are not ivory towers, they're not just there working detached from reality. What universities do is also about disseminating the results of their work to the advantage of society. I would stop here. Thank you. I don't know whether we've lost contact with Mr. Oh, no, he's here. Just the video was off. Sorry. We didn't see your picture. We feared that you were not there anymore. Now, we're going to have a few minutes for questions, but before, I'd like to briefly touch on another topic. Professor SUNSTEIN, talking about diversity. This is a topic that the Republicans and the Trump administration are meaning a certain way, you know, the topic of diversity. Well, you mentioned a law of the state of Indiana which imposes a sort of intellectual diversity, which you define, if I'm not mistaken, tackling. Can you tell us something more about this law in Indiana on diversity?
Yes, so the Indiana law is intended to promote and ensure diversity at a university. And at first glance, that's an excellent idea. If we have people who are only left of center or only right of center at a university, that's not ideal. We want a range of views. But pause over the idea for a moment. Do you want to say that in a literature department, it's required that there be Marxists? Would you want to say that in a literature department, it's required that there be followers of Hitler? Would you want to say that in a literature department, there must be people who think that Darwin was wrong? In a literature department, do you need people who think that space aliens have come and have written all our novels? So viewpoint diversity can't mean what it sounds like. It was intended to mean, I think, in Indiana, that people can't be just left of center, which is a good idea. People shouldn't just be left of center at a university, but it's very hard to see how the law can be made sufficiently specific so as to promote its goal. I think it is appropriate to say to universities in some, let's say, persuasive way, rather than as a legal requirement, please ensure there's an appropriate diversity of views. I teach at a law school, and if we didn't have people at Harvard who were right of center, that would be a problem. I would like to see more people who are right of center. We do have some, but viewpoint diversity doesn't mean you have to have people on your campus who hate Jews and think they should all be exterminated. So the idea is very hard to operationalize.
I asked this question because the state of Indiana is governed basically by Republicans, and that's been the case for many years. And this just to highlight and underline that the idea of academic autonomy is not something that was created now by Trump, because the freedom-killing law that was voted in Florida came into force, if I'm not mistaken, 3.5 years ago, and it was promoted by DeSantis, I think, which was the governor who even tried to run Trump unsuccessfully, just to give you some context. Now, instead, I have a question for Professor Cartabia. In the context of this greater regulation in Italy and more limitations, if I think of the accusation by J.D. Vance during the conference in Munich, he said that we kill freedom. Maybe he was thinking of cases that are not really justifiable or defined as offense against the head of state, which is something that we have in Italy. Even in France, someone was sentenced because they offended the head of state. So do you think that we really we can maybe what do you think about the comment by J.D. Vance? Well, the reference to the violations to that. The fact that we can use criminal law to punish certain types of expressions, so offense against the head of state and the institution is an example, but there are many other uses of criminal law. For defamation is another case. Now, Here, this all comes from a text, the Criminal Code, which dates back to 1830. So, sorry, 1930. So, of course, it was influenced by a certain type of culture and a certain way of using criminal law also to maintain the respect for institutions, respect for the state. And on this point, we could mention the American case where you cannot punish anyone who burns the flag, if I'm not mistaken. You cannot punish anyone for burning a flag, and I think this is a clear example. Well, here, you can be punished if you offend the institutions and such, and so if you burn a flag. This is a starting point that is very different. I think there is room for correction and for improvement, again, following this idea of preserving rights with relative limitations. A few years ago, I was still at the Italian Constitutional Court, and the Italian Constitutional Court declared the unconstitutionality of a law whereby people could be sent to jail for defamation through the press.
So defamation is still a crime, but the court says, are we sure that we want to use the most severe punishment to protect the reputation of someone? Well, reputation must be protected, but with these tools, well, it's very proportionate. And so the court intervened and eliminated something that was more of a symbol than actually real. I don't think that there was any practical enforcement lately, but it goes against the sense of freedom that was part of the Republic, and it wasn't part of the DNA when the criminal code was written. Well, luckily, the Constitutional Court wasn't there. Well, the Constitution is in the hands of several institutions. Well, Mark Zuckerberg said that if Facebook and Instagram kept supporting the Democrats, well, they would be put in jail for life. Well, this is just an aside. Particular case. I still have a question, but I would like to wait if we have some audience, some questions from the audience, since we only have 10 minutes left. Otherwise, I keep going. We have a question. Well, thank you. My question is about the role of the European Union in protecting freedom of expression, because in some aspect of law, like the rights of consumers, it's something that depends on both the EU and the member states. So what's the role of European Union as far as freedom of expression, and should this role change in the next few years? So this is a question for Professor Cantabria. Well, yes, European Union protect fundamental rights. As students, a very technical question. So the European Union intervened in Hungary because there was even a transnational issue of provision of services in different countries of the EU. Hungary is part of the EU, so there must be a link with an area where the EU can intervene. The European Charter can apply if there is an area that is delegated to the European Union. Of course, this can have further spillovers. We have a link there, but then we can have further consequences. And we're now talking about freedom of speech.
Cose importanti anche riguardo alla libertà di espressione. In Europa non ci sono.
Well, in Europe, we don't just have the national constitution. We also have the European Convention of Human Rights, and this is a general framework, and it established like the minimum standards of protecting rights in all 46 countries that signed the Charter. These, again, there are different levels of complexity and protection. And there is a lot of dialogue among the different institutions that are called up to protect these.
Seguendo la scia di quella prima domanda.
Well, following on that first question, a few weeks ago in some Italian universities, there was a sort of a fight. Well, there were some students that would rather not have investments from private people in university for weapon and army research purpose. So can we think about freedom of speech in these area as regards these choices? Well, I also had a curiosity about private universities and students' associations in university. Can a student association, for instance, organize an event where they, for instance, invite Hamas to speak, or Netanyahu, just to use some extremes here, or is there some limit? Well, as far as funds, I would like to link to what Professor SUNSTEIN said earlier. So the topic of funds is very important to understand how academic freedom actually works. Besides some cases where there is direct influence on some parties, but are all so evident and clear, well, I think that today, academic freedom in our country and in Europe depends on the availability of funds. I don't see the danger of distributing funds only if you support this thesis. I think the most concrete danger is the fact that universities don't have the resource to carry out research, don't have funds to carry out research. Italy has a very low level of investments and funds given to school and education and university in particular. Through funds, we can do a lot of things. We can give a presence to some areas, but we can also have some research areas die because there are no money to support them. And I don't think there is anything wrong in using external funds, starting from the funds from the EU. The European funds are among the biggest supporting research in the different member states. Of course, they can be linked to certain projects, but they cannot intervene on the content or the outcome. They cannot be conditioned on getting a certain result. I think that nowadays the biggest problem of public universities is receiving funds without conditions and also coming from different resources than the one dedicated by the ordinary funds to support a university, because it's not sufficient. Freedom of association of students. Well, in Bocconi University, there are a lot of students' associations, but there are some rules for their activities. Well, your example was really extreme. Your initiative would be also highly politicized, so there is procedures so that these would not Well, a university is a place where we should understand what happens. It's not a place of propaganda, so there are different procedures to follow, and I would like to use Professor Sunstein's classification because what he says, a regulation is acceptable when it's content neutral, and it cannot be based on viewpoints. So his very clear distinction can really help us.
Grazie. Marta.
Thank you, Marta. I don't know if Professor Sunstein would like to add something on the topic of inviting Hamas or Netanyahu to a university debate, but we see that you also wrote about occupation tents in a campus. So my last
al nostro tema che riguarda
question
non preoccupazioni specificamente ideologiche
is not strictly related to ideology, but is more practical, meaning espionage. And I'm referring to China because there is an idea recently, probably a rumor, so that university, due to a lack of attention, can become a place where researchers are at the service of Chinese governments, and they do some espionage and then sell information to China. And these, of course, mainly focus on scientific research. I think there were a few cases of some Chinese worker in university labs. They were fired, and once they came back to China, they received some awards. Do you think this is a real concern, since right now Europe would like to import brains because of the situation in the US? So it's something we should be worried about as well. And then, since we are about to close in a few minutes, I would like to say that we are at the end of the festival, and at 6 at Teatro Carignano, we'll have Professor Boeri with a final balance of these festivals. So please, Professor Sunstein, if you want to go on with your comments.
Thank you for that. So let's take the easier question, tents. So if people are building tents on private property, meaning property that's not theirs, then it's fair to say you can't build tents, because it doesn't matter whether the tent is about the Middle East or about horses or about time travel. So no tents, that's okay. On China, I feel we need to know a lot more. So the first question is whether the espionage charges are accurate. If they are accurate, it's completely legitimate to take steps to prevent espionage by any country. That's completely fair. And then the hard question is, suppose you have some number of students from a country, doesn't matter which country it is, and most of them are, let's say, not spies, but some of them are spies, then the question what you do is not clear. So if many of them are terrific students who are adding to the community, that's a positive thing, and to stop it would be regrettable, and it would be better to try to find a way to prevent spying without preventing people from the country from coming at all. And that would be the first line of defense rather than a blanket prohibition.
Thank you.
Just to echo this last comment you've just made, if there is a problem of espionage, you do it through investigation and through targeted measures, individual actions, shutting down and preventing the presence of a variety of students, especially international students, means killing the soul of university. The word university contains the root of universe, and so by its own vocation, universities are open to internationalization, and in history, it's been the first factor of globalization in the world. Students would go to Bologna from all over because of a professor, and nobody looked at the nation of origin or the belonging or the orientation. So let's preserve the university in its great value because it is the driver, the engine of civilization. Thank you very much. Thank you all. I think it's a fantastic conclusion to today's debate. Thank you very much. I do have friends who at the moment are there in a sort of a limbo waiting to know what is going to happen in the United States. They're studying it, they don't know where they're going. So thank you, and thank you very much, Professor SUNSTEIN, for being with us today. Thank you.
Ricordiamo a tutti che c'è la chiusura del festival alle ore 6 al Teatro Carmignano. Grazie.